And so it's good to see everyone as we come to the conclusion of the book of Exodus this morning with the portion Pekudei found in the Eitz Chaim on page 564. So 564 in the Eitz Chaim, whatever edition of Chumash you're using, look for Pekudei, which is chapter 38 of Exodus, beginning with verse 21, 38:21. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we come, and this portion, like last week, Vayakel, describes how everything was followed through, how every commandment about the design and construction of the Mishkan, of the portable sanctuary, and all the vestments for the Kohanim, all the vessels that were required and objects that were required for use inside the Mishkan, Vayakel, and this week's portion, Pekudei, describe how they were all completed. They were all constructed, sewn, hammered, whatever, and it was all done. So we have the portion begins, or on 564 in Eitz Chaim, Eile Pekudei HaMishkan, Mishkan Ha'idut, Asher Pukad al Pi Moshe, Avodat HaLeviim, Biad Itamar, Ben Aharon HaKohen. So as it's translated here in Eitz Chaim, these are the records of the tabernacle of the pact, which were drawn up at Moses's bidding, right? Al Pi Moshe, by the mouth of Moses, by Moses's bidding, the work of the Levites under the direction of Itamar, son of Aaron, the priest. Okay, so Aaron has 4 sons. Itamar is designated, his name came up in last week's portion as well. He's designated among the 4 sons to kind of be the one to oversee on behalf of the Kohanim and future Leviim as to what was going on. And these are the records. So it raises a question: what kind of records do we need? All we need is just an affirmation that everything was done. So the records could be of all the donations that were brought in. They needed a bookkeeper to keep track of all the donations. The Levi family gave this amount, the Cohen family gave this amount, et cetera, et cetera. Perhaps those are the records. And also not just the gold and silver that was donated, but maybe other objects too that were donated, and how here are the records of the donations, and here are the records of everything that went out, right? So income and expenses. But I'm not a bookkeeper, so that's just the easiest way that I can picture this. So there's below the line about these records that Moses was keeping. So if we look below the line on 564, in this parsha, Moses gives a detailed accounting of the expenditures for fashioning the tabernacle and its furnishings. Why did Moses feel obliged to give this detailed accounting? A detailed account, right? God doesn't command Moses to keep a record. It's just, God isn't mentioned here. It's only, God is in verse 22, Uvitzalel ben Uri ben Hur lamate Yehuda, asa et kol asher tziva Adonai et Moshe. And Betzalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, did everything according to the command of God to Moses. So Betzalel did everything accordingly in terms of design and construction, and the records are just from Moses and Itamar. So why? Some Israelites knew that they would have taken advantage of handling all that gold and silver for their own enrichment, right? So Moses could have been tempted. All this gold and silver coming in, who's going to notice if I take a piece of gold here, a piece of silver there? Nobody's going to know. So the average Israelite thought if they were in charge, maybe they would have taken some themselves. So they suspected Moses of being no better than they were. Thus, the Midrash emphasizes that leaders of the community must be above any suspicion of personal aggrandizement. So perhaps the idea that Moses is keeping good records is a lesson for all of us, for future generations, that leaders and everyone, therefore, need to keep an accurate accounting, right? And so, there are, my father and I know this from the conservative movement, from members of the Rabbinical Assembly who have been brought up on charges by their synagogue, if not by county and state jurisdictions, for rabbis misusing the synagogue discretionary funds. And there was a case in our own Montgomery County a number of years ago with an area synagogue where at that point I made sure I had access. Well, just so we understand the inner workings or behind the scenes working of a synagogue. Most rabbis of congregations, no matter what the denomination, in America at least, have something called a discretionary fund. So that's one of the options for making a donation to a synagogue. When you go online or call the office and they ask you what fund you'd like this money donated to, one of the options is the rabbi's discretionary fund, which, based on the definition, is, in my case, up to my discretion how I want to spend that money. So there's usually not much oversight of it. And therefore, when I first came to Shaarei Tefillah 28 years ago, there was a separate checking account that only I had access to at the time for the discretionary fund. I was in charge of all checks that came into the office. I made the deposits, and I would write out checks. That way, that would ensure confidentiality in case I needed to help perhaps a member of the synagogue or somebody else in the community with whatever help they needed. And it could also be used for whatever other charitable purposes I want it to be used for. When the issue came up with a colleague of a Montgomery County synagogue, I'd say it's 20 years ago already, almost 20 years, I decided at that point not to have sole control of my discretionary fund and rather have it incorporated into the synagogue's budget. In other words, that shift the account over into the synagogue itself. And Saul has memory of that, since Saul, long time on finance committee in our synagogue. So I gave over complete confidential oversight by giving the discretionary fund over to the synagogue's accounts, but it only meant that the executive director and I would know how the money was used. So it's a little bit less confidential, but still confidential. I don't think only that the finance committee can see what goes in and what goes out of the discretionary fund, but not exactly what payments are being made. So that's just how I decided to do it. And I think a number of other rabbis in the area have decided not to have sole control over their discretionary fund because of this what's here in the Torah, but more so because of what's happened to rabbis across the country and being brought up on charges of abuse, using the discretionary fund for personal use and not for what it's for. So this idea of personal aggrandizement is not just a general commandment to be worried about, its actual real life. So the commentary goes on below the line on 564 about an example of this. The family that prepared the incense for the temple services would never let their relatives wear perfume, lest some people suspect them of using temple incense for their personal benefit. Right? There was a family or two that the Mishnah, the first collection of Jewish law from 2,000 years ago, describes how the incense was made and which Kohen family was in charge of making the incense. Right? So the recipe is there in the Mishnah, and then it describes which Kohen family is was designated to be the ones in charge of making it. And they decided, best nobody in the family use cologne, right? So I'm not sure how common that was at that time. Anyway, to do so, maybe it was only the wealthy that would go around anointed, because how often did people bathe at that time? So it must have been pretty smelly to live before indoor plumbing became so popular. And so people would anoint themselves with oil or perhaps spray themselves with incense in order to offset the smell. So but the Kohen family in charge of incense made sure that their family members didn't use perfume because they didn't want people to think, oh, there goes that family. They must be using some of the material that we donated for their own use. So to make sure that nobody could ask questions about that, they didn't do it. And then the commentary goes on. The official who supervised the shekel offering would wear a special garment with no pockets and no long sleeves when he did so that no one could suspect him of pocketing public funds, right? So even special clothing for the people in charge of collecting the annual shekel tax, would have special clothing to make sure that that he couldn't pocket any of those shekels. And then it ends, a person should strive to please people as strenuously as one strives to please God, right? We want to be honest and above board with God, and we should be that way with our fellow human beings and fellow members of the community. So the whole idea of keeping records here leads to this discussion about how important it is for leaders and community leaders to keep good records so that they can maintain the trust from the community itself. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to point out. And then the portion goes on to list exactly how much gold and silver came in, and also with all of the other garments and other objects that were brought in for donations. And then there's this interesting point at the end of one of these lists on page 567. It's verse 21 of chapter 39. So 39:21, it's right at the end of what's designated as the second aliyah for Pekudei. Okay, so 39:21, top of 567 has this verse: Vayirkasu et hachoshen mitabotav el tabot ha'ephod biftil techelet. So a cord of blue was tied to the breastpiece, holding it in place from the rings of the breastpiece to the rings of the ephod. So the breastpiece would be connected to the ephod, which is the particular robe or cloak that the Kohen wore, the Kohen Gadol wore. So there'd be rings on both. And there's this blue cord that would keep the breastpiece, the choshen, attached to the ephod. Liot al cheshev ha-ephod, so that it rested on the decorated band of the ephod. Velo yizach ha-choshen me'al ha-ephod, so that it would not come loose from the ephod, kasher tziva Adonai et Moshe, as God had commanded Moses. Okay, so just simply put, the breastpiece was tied with a blue cord to the ephod as God had commanded. Okay, so just one in a series of details about how the Kohen Gadol's garments were done. But there's this interesting comment below the line on 567. The breastpiece was the symbol of justice. Thus, it is referred to as the breastpiece of judgment back in Exodus 28, when it was first described how to do it. Choshen HaMishpat. That's what it was called in 28:15. So it's the breastpiece of judgment, right? All the 12 tribes are represented on it with a different stone for each tribe on this breastpiece. So it's called the breastpiece of justice, so that it represented of proper relations between people and their neighbors. The ephod, which is the cloak on which it rested, was the symbol of worship. That is a proper relationship between people and God. So you have justice resting on worship. When religion is properly understood, justice and worship can never be separated from each other. So that's just an interesting comment from this commentator or interpreter Block, who's brought here by the commentary, how justice and worship need to go together. So you can't just worship in isolation. You can't just do justice in isolation. Justice is with a sense of doing justly in the name of God, and also worshiping God in a just and equitable way. So to make sure that the choshen is tied properly to the ephod is seen as a a metaphor for how justice and worship should go together. Okay, and then so everything is described here, and then the God's presence then rests on the Mishkan. Okay, we're going to see in the book of Leviticus how then the Kohanim begin a 7-day consecration ceremony once the tabernacle is built. But here we have at the end of chapter 40, the end of the book of Exodus, a description about how now that the Mishkan is constructed, God's presence lowers. So let's look at what's the Maftir Aliyah, which is begins with the end of verse 33 of chapter 40. It says here, Vayachal Moshe et hamlacha. So Moses concluded or finished the work. Verse 34, bottom of 571. Vayachas he'anan et ohel moed. The cloud covered the tent of meeting. Uchavod Adonai. And so it's hard to translate kavod. It's translated here the presence. So kavod usually is not translated as the presence of God. It would be the honor of God or the glory of God, which I guess the editors, the translators of our Chumash decided, well, the glory of God here, it from context means the presence of God. All right, but just know that the word kavod here is just ambiguous. So the presence or glory of God, malei et hamishkan, filled the tabernacle. So the cloud lowered or covered the tent, and then God's presence, God's glory, filled the Mishkan. Velo Yachol Moshe, Moses wasn't able, Lavo El Ohel Moed, to enter the tent of meeting, Ki Shachan Alav Ha'anan, because the cloud was dwelling on it. The word Shekhinah for God's presence is from this word Shachan, the verb of dwelling. Uchavod Adonai Maleyat HaMishkan. So Moses couldn't enter the tent of meeting because the cloud was dwelling on it, and the presence of God, the glory of God, was filling the Mishkan. Right? So this thick fog, this thick cloud, which was right there, prevented Moses from entering. Uvehe alot ha'anan me'al hamishkan, when the cloud rose up above the tabernacle, Yis'u b'nei Yisrael, the people of Israel would start moving. B'chol masehem, in all of their travels. They would start traveling with all their travels, and the book of Numbers describes that. The entire book of Leviticus describes the consecration ceremony of the priests, and then the variety of sacrifices that were going to be offered, and other laws are presented. And then in the book of Numbers, a census is taken of the people, and only then were they moving. So really, from chapter 20 of the book of Exodus, when they arrived at Mount Sinai, chapter 19 of Exodus, when they arrived at Mount Sinai, all the way into the third or fourth chapter of the book of Numbers, everything described there in the Torah happened at Mount Sinai. It's only in the book of Numbers that they start moving. So this is just an allusion to that. So it's not happening here. But when the cloud would rise up above the tent of meeting, that's when that would be the signal for the people to start to move. Verse 37, V'im lo ye'aleh ha'anan, and if the cloud would not rise up, v'lo yisu ad yom he'aloto, then they wouldn't move until the day that it rose. Ki anan Adonai al hamishkan yomam, for the cloud of God would be on the Mishkan during the day, the eish tihiyeh laila bo, and a fire would be there at night. Le'enei kol beit Yisrael b'chol masehem, and to the eyes of all of the people of Israel in all of their journeys. Right? So it's a cloud during the day and it's fire at night, either above the Mishkan or within the Mishkan itself. So that's this cloud that is the physical sign of God's presence. So clearly then, the people of Israel in the desert had a physical representation of God's presence right in front of them, whereas we don't today. That physical presence either is described in the book of Kings as coming down in when King Solomon dedicated the temple in Jerusalem. So it's possible that that cloud was there in the temple, but then in the Babylonian exile, that cloud went away. So for the past 2,500 years, we haven't had God's presence dwelling at the temple anymore. When the second temple was built, I don't think the book of Ezra or Nehemiah described God's presence lowering itself on the, I'd have to check to see in the description there of the building of the second temple, whether that cloud is described, but certainly after the destruction of the temple by the Romans, that cloud hasn't descended again. So part of what we pray for every day is not just the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, but even more so, the return of God's physical presence to the heart of the Jewish community. So there's a commentary below the line on 571 about this physical representation of this cloud. At this point, the commentary says, The embodiments, there are two embodiments of holiness in the Israelite camp. The tent of meeting, which is the Ohel Moed, and the tabernacle, the Mishkan itself. I have to take this phone call. Hold on one second. Okay, sorry about that. It was related to a funeral coming up. Okay. At this point, there are two embodiments of holiness in the Israelite camp: the tent of meeting, which is the Ohel Moed, and the tabernacle, the Mishkan itself. We can think of them as representing a theology of encounter and a theology of presence. Okay, so that's interesting what the commentary is saying. So you have where to go to have an encounter with God, where to go to see the presence of God entirely. I'm looking to see if in the back of the Eitz Chaim there's a picture of how what the tabernacle looked like, and I'm trying to. Oh yeah, there is. Okay, good. On page, just 1 second, another call about a funeral. Just 1 second, please. Okay, when it rains, it pours. Okay, so if you have the Eitz Chaim in front of you, if you turn to page 1520, you can see the design of the Mishkan. Okay, where the tent of meeting is and where the tabernacle is. Okay, so I think the bottom one has better. You have the whole tent. Well, wait a second. That with the description down below. The tabernacle is a rectangular structure comprising 3 zones. These are, in descending order of holiness, the Holy of Holies, the Holy Place, and the outer court. The structure is oriented longitudinally on an east-west axis, with the most sacred zone in the west. An outer perimeter demarcates the sacred area. This is divided into 2 equal squares. The first 2 zones lie in 1 square, right? If you see the picture above, and the outer court constitutes the other square. From the ark in the Holy of Holies, God reaches out to Israel. From the altar for burnt offering, the Israelites reach out to God. Each seems to be located exactly at the point of intersection of diagonals of the square. Okay, so if you see the top grid, you see, and for those of us who don't have the Eitz Chaim, just a second here. Okay, so here's the grid. This is where the Holy of Holies is, right there in this grid of the rectangle. And this is where the altar is. So Israelites, depending on the sacrifice, could be right here inside this perimeter. But only the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur would go in here. And here is a view of what that looked like, right? So this is the architectural blueprint, and this is what supposedly it all looked like. So the question is, what's the Mishkan and what's the Ohel Moed? Okay, because there's both terms are used throughout. So now the commentary here is suggesting the following. a theology of encounter versus a theology of presence. There are moments, bottom of 572, a wedding, the birth of a child, an escape from danger, when God erupts into our lives with a special intensity that transforms us, but that is too intense to be lived constantly. Right? So we have intense moments of where we think they are intense moments, and depending on our what we're thinking and our spiritual awareness at the moment, it could be a spiritually intense time as well. So the examples giving a wedding, a birth of a child, or escape from danger, you could say, wow, thank God in that moment, and feel as if God is there in the moment. Okay, so it's in a moment of intense theological encounter. So, but it's too intense. Those moments would be too intense to have all the time. Imagine a child's wedding going on forever, and the intensity of that forever, right? So you just can't do it. Then there are times when God is a constant presence in our lives. Marriage, not the wedding ceremony, but living the marriage, parenthood, years of good health. They are, so God is a constant presence, might not be always aware of it, especially if we're in good health. We take that for granted. We're not thinking about it in an equally real but less intense manner. So there's intense encounter with God, and then there's a continuing presence kind of like there, but you're not always aware of it. The challenge is to recognize God's constant presence in our lives without its becoming so ordinary that we take it for granted. After all of this dedicated effort, taking up 4.5 portions of the book of Exodus, God comes down and approves of the work. The book of Exodus ends on that note. Our book, which began in darkness, concludes in the brilliant illumination of God's glory before the eyes of the entire house of Israel. Right? So darkness in slavery, when we have the Hebrew midwives going against Pharaoh's decree to kill the firstborn, and ending when those individual families of the people, the descendants of Jacob, become the people of Israel with law and with a system of worship and a tabernacle as well, with the moments for intense encounter with God and moments for constant presence, just like the God's cloud is over the Mishkan itself. Okay, so questions or comments about the portion? Because with the phone calls that came in, I have to take care of some things now, so we'll end for today, and wish everybody a good rest of the week. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone. And so next Wednesday, we will be starting the book of Leviticus. And as the book of Exodus ends, Chazak, Chazak, V'nit Chazek, let us be strong and strengthen one another as we've concluded our study of Exodus, and look forward to continuing with the book of Leviticus next week.
Yashkov, Jonah.
Okay.
And Dad's going to be
Working to you.
teaching
What?
I'm going to be teaching a course
the
here.
Bible.
Oh, good. Good. They're putting you to work. Good.
9-4 for the next 4 Wednesdays.
Oh, that's great. Very good. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
All right.